You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, 48 hours of non-fiction authors every weekend. Book TV has traveled to London to interview some British authors, and we're pleased to have join us this week award-winning British author Claire Tomalin. She has written several books, several biographies, and Claire Tomalin, your most recent book was on Charles Dickens. Why another Charles Dickens book?
That's a good question. There are a lot of Charles Dickens books, going right back to the first great biography written by his best friend, John Foster, who was appointed by Dickens during his lifetime. And Dickens told Foster everything about himself. They really loved each other, those two men. And when Dickens died, Foster said, "There's no more happiness for me now, but I have a duty to write the biography." And he wrote this great 3-volume biography, which I bought years ago. My 3 volumes have fallen to bits as I've used them so much. And they're the basis on which everything about Dickens has been written. Of course, I've written 2 books about Dickens. An earlier book called The Invisible Woman, which was about Dickens and his relationship with Nelly Ternan, the actress. And in a sense, I felt as the years went by, I ought to actually give my full attention to Dickens. It's like climbing Mount Everest. Dickens is like 5 people, you know. Lionel Trilling, your great critic, said the mere record of his conviviality is exhausting, and that's true. You know, Dickens filled his life with parties and jaunts. He filled his life with good works. He filled his life with his work, with his writing. He edited a weekly magazine. He performed his books. It's amazing that one man could have done what he did. So it's a difficult life to write.
When did he live, and how well known was he during his lifetime?
Well, he was born in 1812 when George III was on the throne, and he died in 1870, only 58. He certainly burned himself out, I think, doing all that he did. He was born into a poor family. In fact, his father was in a debtor's prison. His maternal grandfather had to flee the country for embezzling. He worked for the Navy Pay Office, and he embezzled for years and was found out and would have gone to prison. So he had this not very promising background, but he was a very bright little boy, and though he had almost no education, he learnt shorthand as a young man. He became a reporter. He began to write sketches of London life. He gave them to newspapers, and then he sold them to newspapers. They were very popular. Then a friend said, why not make them into 2 volumes and publish them and get an illustrator? Cruikshank, great artist. 1836 they were published, and they were a huge hit. They're still very well worth reading if you want to know what London was like in the 1830s. And another publisher saw this and said, we want to commission you to write a novel, and that was The Pickwick Papers, his first novel, which absolutely made him famous. So really, between leaving school at 15 and the age of 24, he made himself. And from then on, he was famous, and he became world famous, and he was translated all over the world. He was a huge hit in America, as you know, two great trips to America. He was really a keen Democrat and pretty well a Republican. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, he often described himself as a Republican. He had Republican friends. He didn't really believe in the monarchy, though during his life Queen Victoria was a great success as a queen, so he sort of, at the very end of his life, he met her and they talked politely together. But he welcomed the revolution of 1848 in Paris when they got rid of the king, and he always believed in the little people. And when he first went to Boston, his first trip, he said that's what he wanted to say in his books, that it's the little people who matter. It's not the great, it's not the rich. It's Smike and Little Nell and people of no significance. He wanted to show that they were significant, that they mattered. He was an extremely good man. He did a great deal of good. He raised money for good causes. He helped people. He set up a home for homeless women, London prostitutes, young London prostitutes, and he gave huge energy to running that for 11 years. I mean, he even chose their clothes, he visited all the time, he appointed the matrons. Absolutely remarkable, while he was writing his great books. And then he had a crisis. He met the young actress, Nelly Ternan. He parted from his wife. He behaved appallingly to his wife Catherine. Here was this very good man who wanted to be seen to be good, doing something awful. And that made the last part of the book very difficult to write, because to write about somebody who is extremely good, who's done something bad, who is trying to deal with that, trying to partly conceal it, partly justify himself, it's a difficult thing to write about as a biographer. So people say, do you love Dickens? Yes, you can't write about someone unless you love them. But it was very painful for me writing that part of the book.
Claire Tomalin, would it be fair to say that Charles Dickens is the English Mark Twain?
Yes, absolutely. He didn't. I mean, Mark Twain in some ways was even wittier than Dickens, I have to say. In fact, Dickens's last manager for his touring performances of his work, Dolby, went on and became Mark Twain's manager, so they actually have a link. Yes. He quarrelled in America because they didn't have a copyright law, and he was terribly angry about that. He was very popular in America, and he was getting no money from his books, so he fell out with the Americans. But then when he went back in 1867, 1868, he had a real love-in with the Americans, and it ended very, very well.
Claire Tomalin is the winner of the Whitbread Book Award, which is what?
The Whitbread Book Award was set up several decades ago. It was rather a complicated prize with several categories. And I first won it with my first book about Mary Wollstonecraft, because they set up a special category for first book. So it was very important for me. It was marvellous. But each year it causes a lot of controversy, because they're setting up the best novel against the best biography, against the best poetry, against the best first book, and it's always very difficult to make those choices if you're the judge. I was a judge once. And more recently, I won it for my book on Samuel Pepys 10 years ago, in 2003, and that won the best biography section. And my husband's novel, Spies, won the best fiction. So the press went mad, because of course here were two authors married to each other, head against each other for the prize. And it didn't really matter which of us won the prize, but I did.
Well, those two books, let's start with the most recent. Who was Samuel Pepys?
Samuel Pepys.
And it's spelled P-E-P-Y-S.
Yes, and some of his, the descendants of his family, he had no direct descendants, call it Pepys, but we know it was pronounced Peeps, because he wrote it in the Greek letters, and we can see that. He was born in 1633, and of a poor family. Again, I always write about people who come from humble backgrounds and make their way. I find that really an interesting thing to do. So his father was a tailor, his mother did washing, it was like that in London, a Londoner, Peeps. And he was clever, and he went to St Paul's School, and then he went to Cambridge when Cromwell was running the country, and Cromwell took all the old heads of colleges out of Oxford and Cambridge and appointed his own men, because he knew that if you were to run the country, you needed to have your people teaching the cleverest of the young people, and so he was at Cambridge in a remarkable time. And he had a cousin who was a friend of Cromwell and fought with Cromwell, but then after Cromwell died, the cousin was one of those who decided to support the return of Charles II, and this was a very good move. He was made an earl, and he was given every opportunity, and his young cousin Samuel Pepys got a very good job in the Navy office and made his career. The most interesting thing about him is that he had learnt shorthand at Cambridge, and he started keeping a diary in the year 1660 when Charles II came back. And for 9.5 years, this young man with a young wife wrote a diary of what it was like to live and work in London. And it's one of the most marvellous documents ever written. He was a Renaissance man. He was curious about everything. He was interested in everyone, and he noticed. He had the knack of being in the right place at the right time. So the fire of London, he was there. He was actually, as a schoolboy, he went to see Charles I executed in Whitehall, up the road there, and went back to his school, St Paul's, and boasted about it. He was very strongly against the king at that time, but like everyone else, he came round after